Welcome to Walking by Faith, a podcast from Torch Trust where we talk to blind and partially sighted people about how their lived experience of being visually impaired has impacted their faith and spiritual lives. I'm your host, Lynn Davis.
I'm Ella. I work in product management and I dabble in figurative painting.
When and how did you lose your sight?
A few years ago now, in the middle of the pandemic, it just started fading. I didn't have any warning, there's no family history, just nothing that could have prepared me for it. And it was just probably one of the most terrifying things I've ever been through. I mean, I still have quite a lot of vision left, but it's not as useful as it presents to be. And that's really because of how my brain understands what I'm seeing. So what mine does is it smudges the discrepancies in my sight to make a picture that seems feasible, but it's not real. So I do things like bump into a bollard I didn't perceive, or trip across a tree root that wasn't where I perceived it to be, or think I've read a word correctly when I haven't. And when I say read, I mean like a short word the size of an A4 piece of paper a meter from my face.
Gotcha. So yeah, the sight is trying to kind of fill in the blanks, but it's not always quite doing what it should be doing.
Exactly.
So how and when did you become a Christian?
Pretty young. I was 12. My family are Christians, and I've been to church all my life. So I knew very well who Jesus was, and specifically from seeing how he impacted my parents' lives. Like, they are full of love, and that's because of Jesus. But even then, I remember church being somewhere I didn't really enjoy being. So my faith was more influenced by that of my family, both my parents, my sister, and extended family. So it was just one day I realized I'd never committed myself to him. So I did, because even age 12, I knew who he was, and that accepting his love would be transformational if I let him.
And how has your faith impacted your unique experience of being visually impaired? And I suppose in your case, losing your sight quite recently.
Mm. That's the interesting thing. So Jesus hasn't changed. So in its fundamentals, neither has my faith. But also Christians haven't changed either. But my position in relation to Christians has. And I see that most in church, where I'm now considered valueless because I'm disabled. What I found, at least, and that is quite a broad statement, I should say the Christians that I've interacted here in this country, in the churches I've been to, are often happy to practically serve, but they don't want to know about how blindness impacts my daily life, how prejudiced people are. And it is the single most potent hypocrisy I've ever come across, and it really stinks. And I know by pointing it out, no matter how respectfully or gently, what's happened is I've then been painted as a problem, and it's really exhausting. But my faith that Jesus loves me can't go anywhere because it's wholly dependent on him. And reading my Bible reminds me exactly who he is and why I trust him. And he's the only person I can fully trust. That's what all Christians are supposed to learn.
So, talking a little bit more about church, and be as honest as you like, how has being visually impaired impacted your experience of church? And you've already touched on this, but if you could kind of go into maybe a couple of examples.
Sure. So, have you ever been dismissed by a Bible verse and an incorrect interpretation of it, worst of all? That's the kind of thing that kept happening. So, again, put in parameters around this. Some of the Christians I've come across are the most emotionally dishonest people I've ever met. And I'm yet to find a church that holds true to the Bible and genuinely loves their neighbour. Because actually, I'm not looking for help, despite the fact I'm disabled. I'm looking for Christian brothers and sisters, like a family where my strengths are recognised and my weaknesses are lovingly challenged, and where I'm accommodated the same as everyone else. And vice versa. Instead, I have things like people apologizing for never speaking to me because they don't have the space in their car to give me a lift. I didn't need a lift in the first place, but they've decided to opt out of knowing me on the basis of their attitude. And when that's all you expect me to be, someone who needs help, or as I was once memorably told, broken, you literally cannot perceive me as anything else. And that goes beyond frustrating to actually being damaging. I've had experiences of church in other countries and other people. And it was even in this country, church has always been a mix of good and bad, same as anything. But now I'm really struggling to find anything good to say about it because there's not enough love, and that colours everything else. And it really saddens me because it should not be this way. There is no need for it to be this way.
Thanks for that very honest reflection. And you mentioning churches in other countries. What are the differences, say, between here and other countries you have been to?
Essentially, I think it comes down to a culture where difference is accepted instead of being found as problematic. So if you attend church in a country where multiple languages are spoken and the culture of that country is to ensure that everyone understands in their own language, you don't really have an issue because you're used to providing for people dependent on their needs, not dependent on how you feel able to accommodate them. It just is something that happens. Whereas what I find is church in this country, well, not just church, I come across this in my workplace, I come across this in shops, everywhere I go, as a visibly disabled person, I'm seen as a problem, and people just want to make me go away and deal with things myself rather than maybe taking 2 minutes out of their day to do something that they ordinarily wouldn't do for an adult, but that actually isn't a massive inconvenience for them and would be a really big help to me.
Who has supported you through your faith journey?
My family, like seeing how their love for Jesus informs the way they live their lives. But actually, even they haven't been able to help me cope with some of the questions I've had around sight loss. Truly, only the Bible has been my reliable resource, and a few sermons from people who genuinely understand and have seriously studied the Bible and experienced enough of the hardships of life to not undermine how difficult life can be, so that they know the price of the hope that Jesus gives. It is incredibly costly to have hope, particularly when you're going through extreme suffering. But thankfully, Jesus is a sure thing.
How has your unique lived experience impacted how you see God and God's love?
Sometimes I feel like to be a Christian means suspending your understanding of right and wrong. Like, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard someone say, God was with me in the worst of times, or God is testing me. But then they lightly treat other people's suffering as the lack of theological understanding. And the idea behind it is that if you don't feel God's love when you're suffering, there's something wrong with you. And that is a horrific burden to put on people and an out and out lie. Like, this world is awful. What happens to people in it is awful. And blaming people for their own suffering is one of the cruelest ideas I've ever had the misfortune to come across, especially when Christians have the resources, God's love, to offer genuine comfort. But suffering and bad Christians don't make God any less good. And I fear that too many Christians self hypnotize their way out of the incongruence of a loving God who allows his loved ones to be deeply hurt. And I don't want to hear you question it, at least not without an inspirational conclusion. Um, but they're doing a disservice to God and to those suffering and to themselves, because God genuinely is good and can and should take every single question you have about his goodness. Otherwise, you can never actually know how wide and how vast and deep his love is. And if you're not anchored in his love, you can't love other people well. And then what happens is that you deeply hurt people who are suffering because you choose to protect your unconscious fears and mental comfort rather than offering your father's love to them. And actually, as harsh as that sounds, I care enough about Christians to say this because covering it up does more harm than good. Like, I'm good. I've had to learn who God really is. But too many Christians have not made space for me and my questions, so I've had to leave. And out amongst non Christians, there is so much more honesty about how people feel, and it is a relief to be around honest people, even though they cannot point me to Jesus when I need it. And at least they offer their love, or they don't and don't bother me, and it doesn't undermine me like Christian hypocrisy. And actually, it's the love of my non Christian friends that has helped me learn my new disabled self as a person with value and worth.
What does walking by faith mean to you?
Oh, this is an easy one. It's just remembering who Jesus is and who I am to him and who others are to him too. That's it.
What is your wellness tip for any listeners who are on a faith journey and who have perhaps also lost their sight, and maybe they've just lost their sight? So this can be anything from an app to a book to an activity.
First and foremost, you've got to know the Bible back to front because you're going to need it to fight off the more sinister and subtle prejudices from Christians. I'd also recommend finding a church with Christians that are full of love and free from prejudice and pride in their learning, and then tell me where it is. Um, but also find people who can love all of you and whom it wouldn't even occur to them to see you as a burden. I'd also strongly recommend secular counselling. Unpicking prejudice with a counsellor is the single most effective thing I've done for my own mental health, and it's actually plugged me back into my own power. Because when I became visibly disabled, I developed a severe allergy to hypocrisy from the overexposure. But even that can be a useful thing. So by learning it and using it first for my good, then I can use it second for others.
We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Walking by Faith. If you'd like to get in touch about anything you've heard on the podcast, or if you'd like to leave any comments or feedback, you may do so by phoning 01858 438 260 or by emailing info@torchtrust.org. We'll be back soon, but until then, from me, Lynn Davis, goodbye for now, and thanks for listening.